Hello, good evening, everyone. I'm Lisha. I work as assistant curator at S.M.A.K, and I'm very happy to welcome you to the online lecture with Clémentine Deliss. It's the second one in the series of lectures in the context of the exhibition Museum for a Small City, rebuilt by Belgian artist Richard Venlet. Rebuilt is the third presentation of the artwork Museum for a Small City, and the exhibition is conceived as a platform for a critical engagement with S.M.A.K's permanent collection, for which the artist curates different presentations of artworks and documents of the archive. In this way, the museum is provided with an instrument for opening up its history to alternative narratives. With this series of lectures, S.M.A.K aims to connect Richard Venlet's contextual exercise with ideas relating to the contemporary efforts of museums to revalue their history and also to reflect upon the way collections can relate to political, social, and cultural issues. Last week, we had a very nice and interesting evening with Suzanne Cotter, the director of Mudam in Luxembourg. And for tonight, we are very happy that Clémentine Delis is with us for a lecture. Clémentine Delis is a curator, publisher, and a cultural historian. And at the moment, she is guest professor at the University of Fine Arts in Hamburg and associate curator of KW Institute for Contemporary Art in Berlin. She's also co-director of Lagos Photo Festival 2020, entitled Rapid Response Restitution, which takes an unusual and participatory approach to current discussions on the return of Africa's cultural heritage. It's within this context that she created the website homemuseum.net. Between 2010-2015, 2010-2015, she directed the Weltkultur Museum in Frankfurt, where she set up a new research laboratory to remediate collections within a post-ethnological context. She wrote down her experiences from this period, and this resulted in a book, The Metabolic Museum, which was published earlier this year. The book is partly an account of her time at the Weltkultur Museum, and it's also partly a much wider reflection on the nature and the role of the museum, and also a reflection on how we can approach collections and institutions differently. In the first place, with a concern and indignation towards the so-called ethnographic collections, but her concerns can absolutely also be projected to other collections and other institutions. Within her research and strong interest in these alternative approaches, she co-curated in 2018 Hello World, revising a collection in Hamburger Bahnhof in Berlin. And since 2015, she has been working on models for a Metabolic Museum University. Clémentine, you have an impressive curriculum, a strong opinion and experimental approach towards a contemporary relationship with art objects and the collection they are mendied in. So we are very pleased that you want to share your experiences with us tonight. And before we can start, I would like to make one last practical announcement and a call to the public. If questions may come up along the way, they are very welcome. You can use the chat in Facebook and also the chat in YouTube to ask your questions to Clémentine, and after her lecture, I will direct the questions to Clémentine. Clémentine will talk more or less 40 minutes, and after that, we have time for the Q&A. So, Clémentine, thank you very much for being with us tonight, and it's my pleasure to give you the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Licie and Tanya and everybody at S.M.A.K, as I call it. I wish I could have been in Ghent now. Very much so. I would have seen the fantastic exhibition by Richard Venlet and met you all, but this is the situation. So I'm going to be as precise and as short as I can. I think what I'd like to do is give you kind of some thoughts on the metaphor, like a notebook on metaphors at the moment. And metaphors are more important than we realize because we're in a period where institutions are being rethought, in particular museums. In Germany, where I'm sitting, in Berlin, museums are not open. Exhibitions are being set up in time for the opening, but they are not being attended by the public. And so there's a kind of quite a controversially fertile ground within which to work. I want to take you through photographs that I'm using to reference these different aspects of the museum, these metaphors, a museum as a casino, something that Theodor Adorno spoke about, the Museum of Repentance. So respect to my colleague and friend Azun Wakbogu for that. The museum as a degenerative or a generative body, the museum as a rhetorical structure, the museum as a home, as something quite private, very essential, very kind of like the first museum was in a home. The museum as a vast field. So the museum in a way without any kind of predetermined container, something that is much more polycultural, much more flourishing. The museum as a lazaret, which is probably what I think museums should be right now. And finally, the models of a museum university that I've been working on now for 10 years or even more, I'd say, but which I'm now really happy to be doing and experimenting with a group of great artists and scientists at KW in Berlin. So the first picture takes us, or actually, no, let me begin with the museum as casino. I didn't want to, I guess I could have taken some obvious photographs, Mudam or other places which have been casinos. And I could have taken some images of department store type museums, but really what I want to emphasize here is this corrupted nature of the museum as a place to contemplate ownership, to play with risk. I mean, obviously, if you're gambling, you're playing with risk, to acquire capital, to flaunt prestige. But actually, at the end, even though it might have a kind of a populist flair, it banks on something else. It banks on exclusive, sealed off markets, whether it's in contemporary art or whether it's in so-called tribal art, and where both the question of pricelessness and infinity go up on trial, and it's always the masterpiece that wins in the end. So this is how I would, if you like, see the question of the casino at this point in time. So we're in this weird kind of situation where the department store effect, the consumerist effect, the kleptomaniac, accumulative effect of a museum shows up everything that we actually don't want it to be today. This is a case of a kind of a department store notion. It's one of the most significant photographs that I encountered when I worked as the director of the Rhetorical Museum in Frankfurt for 5 years between 2010 and 2015. It is the result of an expedition paid by taxpayers' money, Frankfurters, who paid for a group of anthropologists from the university and the museum in Frankfurt to go to the Sepik River in Papua New Guinea and collect as much as they could, because, hey, didn't we realize at that time the idea was that these cultures would be disintegrating, that their cultures and their products would no longer exist. So this was all part of a Rettungsethnologie or a salvage anthropology. But it also shows you the seriality, the kleptomania of this kind of collecting, the kind of scientific element that you need to have many things of one kind in order to do a comparative analysis, rather like with the natural sciences and ornithology or other aspects of the natural sciences. This is particularly questionable because it's so late, it's 63, and the museum in Frankfurt actually didn't have a museum at all. So it was going out to accumulate and to hoard. And I think this question of the object and the excision of an object, the extraction of an object, the excision of an organ, of a question of energy and dynamic and history and culture and heritage, to remove it is always done at that time in relationship to the human body, right? So this is a particularly unpleasant photograph. I apologize if some of these photographs are hurtful to people. I still think that they're important to be shown. These are two Italian anthropologists taking a plaster cast of a live man who has, and this is where it gets a little bit complicated, but very evocative, is that I think the man is actually wearing jewelry on his legs, but it has it connotes some kind of different effect. This type of material has led us quite rightly now to a big debate on restitution. This is just a collage of the latest, or some of the latest articles that have come out in the press. We're talking about 17 objects. We're talking about 26 objects. We're talking about a traumatic history that is both a corporeal, physical trauma, as well as a material trauma. So to quote Luke Willis Thompson, Black Lives Matter. Black Lives matter. Restitution is a very serious question today. And this issue of restitution not only relates, in my opinion, to the question of returns, of returning the artifacts, the millions that are in Germany, for example, but equally of the whole question of sequestration, of not allowing access. So you engineer a diplomatic procedure, you return iconic objects. The question of restitution here is related intimately to the issue of the iconic. There's no question of another kind of debate emerging around what should be returned. What is, if you like, the energy, the generative material that today would be important for the younger generation? Obviously, it is the 26 objects, but it begs the question as to what else has been removed that might be of extremely significant importance to the future. So this issue of restitution affects every museum. This is a shot by Armin Linke in one of the storage spaces of the Weltkulturen Museum. It's a plaster cast, but it shows you really the kind of, how can I put it, the brutality of this relationship between human and non-human matter. This is a recent photograph that was presented in the press. It's the signage that I had made at the time, a glass box, a light box, and it's been recently sprayed with anti-colonial action. So this leads us really, into this question of ailment, of illness, of a sick institution. And this is certainly something that I noticed and which I write about in the book. And that is this question of how you can heal something from within, or whether you need external factors, whether you need a particular dialogical structure or infrastructure with which to begin to slowly approach the task of remediating the abhorrence of the removal of cultural heritage from so many parts of the world, and its hoarding, its plundering and its hoarding in Europe. This is the book, in case you haven't seen it. I'm not here to plug it, but I just wanted to tell you that the experience that I had in Frankfurt was particularly important for me. I hadn't directed a museum before, no idea about museums. I was very interested, and I still am, in the question of autonomy in an institution and the relationship between autonomous action, the prioritization of space within an institution, and the question of how a new institution is generated. Is it generated through a curriculum? Is it generated through a collection? Is it generated because a group of people like each other and come together and want to formalize this affinity? What is it today that creates an institution, a new infrastructure? So in this case, when I decided to take on this position, I knew I was taking the most maligned, malignant, corrupted form of cultural institution anywhere in the world, really, I guess, but mainly in Europe. compares to other museums, to natural history museums, to art history museums, to contemporary art museums, to modern art museums, because it also deals with the hoarding of objects, with the question of capital, with the passing of time in particular. I think this is for me, one of these most interesting aspects is whether these artifacts can defy anachronism. Does the fish trap that you see now in front of you, and the double-sided lobster trap behind it, and the very large one also from the S.M.A.K at the back, does it actually provide us with a clue to a future technicity? Is it an object of virtue? Is it something that goes beyond its incarceration within a definition, a taxonomy, a classification, a narrative? Can it go beyond that? Can it sort of like become viral in its own way? So this is Otobongankanga in 2011, working with the museum. She had worked on currency, on jewelry, and on weaponry. And here, an assemblage. Assemblages are very important in this methodology. It's an assemblage that was put together by the artist Ante Majewski. So different, if you like, to this kind of assemblage, where it's much more connected to, okay, on the one side I have the clubs, then I have the throwing knives, then I have the jewelry. With Majewski, it's a creolization of Chinese, African, different parts of Africa, just different objects right down to matchsticks. And with this is something which taught me a lot, because I could see that it would be impossible to extract one particular object, one particular classification system from a table like this. The table would defy this exclusionary, isolatory type of hermeneutic. This is the studio in the Weltkulturen Museum. Up on the top, Perks and Minnie, Pam, preparing a new collection. There, a kind of guys, ACOG from Munich, and down below, the studio and the laboratory of Buki Akib, a Nigerian designer who I invited over. So this whole way of working was basically saying, hold on a minute, we can do what we want in a museum. I say that with not naivety, but at the end of the day, with the position of director who said, I have 3 villas. One villa is being used for storage. Are we crazy? What do you do in a villa? You live, you entertain, you cook, you do everything that people do when they live together. If this villa has now been connected since 1968 to a museum, then I have to work with this. I can't pretend that it's a corporate building, a museum-specific building. It clearly isn't. And so it made me introduce apartments on the top floor, studio spaces, which you see here, totally different each time somebody came. The laboratory, which you have on the right, and which responds to the photographs I just showed you. And then down in the depths, you had the photographic archive with 120,000 photographs, including missionary photography, including anthropological photography, and very interestingly, including 50% photographs of objects, right? The kind of the visual regime of the ethnographer. What happens when they don't photograph in situ? Then they need to recreate the aura of the object, which has lost a kind of a certain element, je ne sais quoi, on the journey from Papua New Guinea to Frankfurt. So this leads me then to this question of, I guess, of the relationship between, again, the relationship between an artifact and a human body, and the colonial, the complexity of the colonial discourse to constantly confuse the two, to make an object like a human like an object. And I'm not going to say ever that this is something that we as human beings do. We constantly anthropomorphize an object, or we render a human being into a subject, into something that should be dominated or transformed, or that should undergo some kind of surgery. But what I am interested, hence the Metabolic Museum, is what happens when you start to look at it as an institution with everything that indicates a corpus, a body, an ailing metabolism, organs, right? And organs is a word that I like using. I've used it for many, many years. When I did a publishing organ called Metronome, it was an organ. Why is it an organ? Because it's vital, right? Okay, you might have an organ that you can remove like an appendix, but even that, the word is brilliant. And in itself, the appendix is worth congratulating. So, but an organ means that it needs vitality. So a publishing organ is out there because all the rest is just rather like today, unfortunately. It's, you know, the level of art criticism is not on the level of an organ right now. We don't sense it as much as we might. Something that is pushing forward. And so I'm interested in this kind of rather strange metabolic idea. I couldn't help putting this Francis Bacon piece because I love it, because it's a kind of it shows in a way this whole question of the fluid, the degenerative, the whole idea of the metabolic in many ways. Equally, this kind of question, this sort of appalling use of the bodies of others, but also the bodies of animals. This is it's an elephant, I guess, but it could be a hippopotamus, I'm not sure, or a rhinoceros. Maybe it is a rhinoceros, I can't remember. I didn't see the full animal, but it was clearly cut out as a part of the culture of stuffed animals. And it's from South Africa. I found it in a museum in Cape Town. I think that the most problematic area right now, which I'd like to talk about, is the issue of entering into life's unknowns by entering into the artifacts that were collected and became the subject of great intrigue in the 19th centuries, earlier as well, obviously, with Jesuit priests. There were, and the Vatican has the largest collection of ritual artifacts from, say, just Africa alone. But this is a new thing that is happening now, new in the sense that the Musée du Quai Branly, Jacques Chirac in Paris, has prides itself on being the first museum to introduce a CT scanner into its building in order to identify the internal constitution of 150 objects. Now, 150 objects of high ritual import. So objects that, if you like, might have a particular oily patina, objects that have nails in them, like this Nkizi, which is just about to go through a CT scanner, feet first, in other words, as a corpse, not as a living human being, important to note. So being pushed into a CT scanner through the language and discourse and academia that comes out of a type of mix of prehistory, archaeology, forensic anthropology. You don't want to go too far. It's basically everything that post-colonial and decolonial isn't. It's everything that post-structuralism would not be happy to condone. I don't know whether it would fit into a particularly speculative realist position. That I don't know. But what I do know is that something is severely wrong. And what they are doing here is they are playing with the relationship between science, conservation, and on the other hand, well, we will find out more from this kind of procedure. It's more relevant to a younger audience than keeping it within an ethnographic and presupposing the mystical and the magical. Here we can really find out what the magical is. So it's a very complex issue because, as you can read here, it actually does allow for a complete reproduction of the original object right into the core. And this means that not only does the museum in Paris own the rights to the replication of this original object, but they own the rights to the images as well. They own the rights to the analysis and use of these artifacts and these objects. Here, for example, a Sanguier statue made out of one piece of wood, a huge thing. It's 82 centimeters high, I believe. They remove the skirt. The skirt is clearly a part of the work, but never mind. We never bring anybody in to discuss the work itself, the the aesthetic, artistic resolution of a sculpture. It's always just the archaeologists and the prehistorians and what have you, the physical anthropologists. And what do they find through the CT scanner? They find out initiate knowledge. They find out that which only the artist knew and the person in charge of the mediation of this initiate knowledge. They find out that from the top of the head through to the umbilical cord and the anus, and here in this higher region, there are ducts, and that these ducts contain what are discussed in this material as drugs, okay, in quotes. So they're looking to understand the contents of the contents of the substance that has been placed inside these cavities. They call this a non-invasive procedure. It is done totally without any agreement from anybody nearing the original community, the original artist, the original culture that produced them. Now, this brings me clearly to the question of the museum as a rhetorical space. So I see this as, I'm interested, if you like, in the relationship of the museum to the body. And I've always been curious about rhetoric. I wished I could have studied it. It was abolished in France in the 19th century. I think Judith Butler teaches rhetoric. I have a friend who studies with her. And rhetoric today would be a brilliantly complex subject matter. But Greek rhetoric interests me too. It interests me in particular because I see it as a mnemonic device, something that allows you to remember where it is you're going. What you're looking at now is a drawing that I did for my students in Karlsruhe 2 years ago, where I'm trying to suggest that there's a connection between the organs of a body and the disposition of a museum as if it's a house. Okay, so it's the museum becomes a rhetorical space for two reasons. One, because it enables a kind of both an individual and a collective fabulation. In other words, a museum allows someone walks into a museum, they can begin to dream. They dream briefly. Sometimes they dream collectively. But it's also a place for the conceptualization of the ontology of the museum and what happens when it transforms, when it mutates, when it becomes corporatized, again, a language of the body. Or when it becomes subject, quite rightly, to a form of institutional critique. And here, I think your show at S.M.A.K is particularly interesting. For me, it led to what we did in Ljubljana for the 33rd Biennial of Graphic Design. And that was to start beaming, start to actually spam the hang. In other words, to create chairs that would allow for people to relax, to sit down, not to worry about having to move and swipe past one artwork, swipe past another one, would bring the museum again closer to a convivial space, closer to home, but then also to think as a curator, wow, hanging a work at the moment is super normative. You know, we know the golden rule, blah, blah, and, you know, in some places, there's more space between two works or whatever, but surely all the space around in between an installation or between two pictures or two photographs, why don't we just spam it? Why don't we dislodge the canon of the curator or the concept of the exhibition or the art historian or whatever and beam what we want in between? It can be out of Facebook, it can be out of Instagram, it can be anything. It can be the new Star Wars or the old Star Wars, but it's there and it creates a referentiality for the person who is in the museum. They begin to see things out of isolation. They begin to complexify. Okay, so I've got these three ladies on the right-hand side and whoa, I'm looking at something from Beirut in the middle, or I'm just, and this kind of what Cedric Price would always talk about as seeing something out of the mind's eye. It's really important today. It's one of the only ways we can, I think, develop a much more inclusive form of visual thinking. This is in the Natural History Museum in Ljubljana. So we basically took it over. This is one model of a museum university where we built the chairs. The students built the chairs. They had beamers for spamming. They had tables so you could place your computer. And we began to listen to a young faculty talking about different aspects of effectively of the organs of the body. So we had eye day, lung day, tongue day, heart day, liver day, and we went to the right locations with which we could discuss questions of circulation, questions of affect. And it was, it was really extremely exciting. And it wasn't done in an aggressive way. We had talked to each museum that we were going to come with 25 chairs and a lot of people, but it was something that I'm very, very keen to do. And that is at the moment to try and always speak, if it's not in a Zoom, then to make sure that I never speak in an amphitheater, that I never play the chocolate box in a conference, right? Here comes a nut crunch, here comes the coffee cream, here comes the vanilla, right? But that you actually work only with artworks around you. So you talk inside an exhibition space, like it used to be, if you remember, right? Now we're shafted into some kind of neutral location where the only reference to an artwork is either a performance or a film or a video. But I want to engage with the exhibitions as they stand. And here you see immediately that between the stuffed fish and the drawing here of, I think, an ant, there's an inevitable creolization taking place. Okay, now let's move to the private museum. The private museum, this is where I'm coming really to the work that I've been doing most recently this year. I was honored to be invited by Azu Nwagbogu, founder and director of the African Artists Foundation, which is based in Lagos, which is, I think, nearly 15 years old, in a house. It's a house museum already. It's not a museum, but it's a house institute or foundation. And with Azu Nwagbogu and his team, including a photographer, Ugochukwu Emebiriodo, and his general manager, we drove to maybe 10 museums in a kind of a span of about 200 kilometers outside Lagos. There are 66 museums, official museums, that belong to the National Council in Lagos, in Nigeria. 66 public museums. But we also looked at smaller museums like this. This is the Heritage Museum of the Kuti family. Here, the entrance to the mother of Fela Kuti, who was brutally treated by the regime at the time. And it's a very touching museum. She was thrown down this famous staircase. I think anybody who knows about Fela Kuti knows about the importance of the family. And today also the son, Sheon Kuti, is a real brilliant activist, in particular around the current anti-SARS movement. But this particular type of museum made us think that perhaps if we wanted to have a debate on restitution, if we wanted to get a discussion going between the relic diplomacy of the Macrons and the Grütters and the museums of the British Museum and the Humboldt Forum and the Musée du Quai Branly with their generous returns of 26 major iconic works, this whole kind of question that perhaps we should start where everything begins, and that is our kind of the human nature to create a kind of a space and to start acquiring a few devices that will trigger off memories, that will remind people of history, that will shift a memory from the past into the future. And so we sent out, we decided to call, this was connected to this concept of rapid response restitution. In other words, do you really think Nigeria is going to wait for 150 years for you to send back several million artifacts? No. Let's get another discussion going. Let's be a little bit more rapid response towards it. And let's ask people through an open call to send in 6 to 12 photographs that signify what we called objects of virtue. In other words, objects of virtue, you can translate it in so many different ways, but my particular interest in an object of virtue is that its virtue comes from its ability to defy anachronism, to provide a clue, to provide a live wire of ingenuity from the past to the present. So we sent out on social media, we sent this letter out. We sent it out in Chinese, in Russian, in several Nigerian languages, from Nigerian Pidgin through to Igbo, Hausa, in Swahili as well, in Wolof, and in Portuguese and in French. And it was all done like that. And it sort of kind of dissipated, or it like mushroomed. And eventually we received 240 entries from several, like 30 or 40 African countries, but also Iran, Saudi Arabia, Latin America, Russia, China. And we invited a group of young emergent artists and students who I work with in Hamburg, who have since Corona been very concerned about communication between young artists. You know, you don't have your biannual as you had before. You don't have residencies. You're not invited to do an exhibition. Everything is sort of suspended. So how do you get to know who you're going to be thinking and working and living with in the future? Who can you exchange private knowledge with, things that you're not sure about? So they were already thinking, my students were already thinking about an online research collection. And then with the generosity of AAF, African Artists Foundation, and the kind of the feeling that we were on we had to test things out. It was an exercise, let's try. Under the rubric of Lagos Photo 20, we invited this group of young artists and designers to create the digital museum, knowing that if we weren't careful, we all would fall into a colonial matrix. We would have, and you think about Mike Kelly's brilliant work, The Educational Complex, right? But we would have our own cultural complexes, our own museum complexes in our heads. And if we weren't careful, we would create it online. So what you see here is a couple of pages, which you never see in this way, juxtaposed on the website, which is, by the way, homemuseum.net. Home Museum in one word, is that there is a channel which is visual and there is a channel which has to do with texts. What we call the kindred narratives are much more than any label. And what we found out, so this is how the website works. Welcome to the Home Museum leads you straight into all the texts written, the manifesto by Birds of Knowledge, by the Young Artists Group, the texts that Azunwagbogu and I wrote together, the texts of the brilliant cultural historian from Nigeria, Oluwatoyin Shogbejan, who works on inclusive participation, guest curator of Lagos Photo this time, and equally of Asia Yakmurian, who brings in an Armenian perspective into the question of the family archive. And then you can see, you can have a story told, you can build your collection, or you can be guided by name. In other words, Birds of Knowledge decided there should be no specification, no taxonomy based on age, gender, or nationality. You can find it out through the works, through the texts. And here, just to give you a sense of what people sent in, all taken usually with a smartphone, ranging from the majority are sort of between 20 and 35, very young. This is just one photograph. We call the people who have taken part in developing Home Museum the co-creators. This is a work by, so the co-creators are both, if you like, people who we don't know and people we know through photography or contemporary art, in this case, Eva Stenram. And you can click on everything and you can create your collection. So it's a beginning to create something that ultimately is not about restoring something removed from you, as in the case with restitution, but is of empowering and encouraging a discussion about what restitution means, which, in the words of Azunwagbogu, means that you begin to develop a museum from the inside out. The great architect isn't necessary in the beginning. The great architect does not determine the roof. Something else determines the roof. And this is where we come closer to the idea of the museum as an open field, right? And in this, when I think of what I'm going to tell you about in a second, the Museum University, then I think of a vast expanse where I can walk around and look at different things. I think of a storage space that is not a bunker, that is not there to seal things off, that does the opposite. It's not a an open storage, which is like kind of gloating. Oh, let's look at what we have. Oh, but a place where you can literally work with not only the matter of the 20th century and backwards towards, or further back in history, but equally the digital, because we are in a crisis moment between the matter of the analog and the matter of the digital. And we have to try and find ways of dealing with that through collections. So this is, the architecture of the Institute of Tropical Agriculture in Ibadan. And this is, for me, one of the most interesting combinations right now, is to see if we can work with agronomy and art practice, something that Renzo Martin has pioneered in his own way with the CATPC. I'm speeding up a bit, I'm aware of time. I think that the current condition made me think already in April, and I drafted a short text, a kind of a manifesto about the museum as a lazaret. I mean, frankly, we should get into these spaces. Maybe they're not going to be for operating on. A museum is perhaps not got everything you need to become an operating theatre for intensive care, but it certainly offers rehabilitation. It offers human rehabilitation as well as collection remediation. And I immediately began to think, okay, so curators are nurses, right? There's so many new curators coming out all the time. What happens if we're in a condition of crisis? They will use the curative of curating and they will become nurses. But if the museum became a lazaret, then we would start to look at the ceiling and consider it as a valid space much more, just like you would use the frescoes. You would hang much, much lower. The actions of relay, of mediation, would be softer, would be more gentle, would not be like the kind of what Luke Willis Thompson calls this impressive auditing, that the artist has to be audited so the institution can be audited so that everything falls within the current regime of what is acceptable, of what is the correct conduct rather than the counter conduct. And I'm very interested, therefore, in this whole issue about what we're going to do right now. Can we, as people working in a particular discussion, I mean, curators are all very different, artists are all very different, but it might be the right time to start talking again without the public, to understand the public as a necessary, a most vital dimension ultimately, but maybe find a different way to access them. So I was invited by KW to start a project, which, let's move away from these fogies, which is about collections, which I proposed would be another model of the Metabolic Museum University in a location like KW where there is no collection. There's an archive of its 30 years of experimental practice, but they're soon to be published as a book in 21, but there's no collection. Whereas Berlin has the power and the capital, sometimes dormant, of private collections, of university collections, of artists' collections, of course, of museum collections. So I've moved right out of this kind of ethnographic area to now look at, in this case, private collectors. And in this case, I was particularly excited to have access to the Erika Hoffman collection. And Erika Hoffman has an inventory system that is purely visual. So what you're looking at are photographs taken at the time of acquisition, rather than photographs digitized. You work with photographs. So this in itself becomes an important choreographic element. And here are some of the photographs that I took to begin to imagine how and what we might juxtapose with these different artworks, if it was possible to borrow them. So from Isa Gensken to Peter Fentz, or here the hand of Miles Davis by Irving Penn and the hand of Black Lives Matter from Wolfgang Tillmans from a few years back, or brilliant, crazy work by Meyer Weissman from 1987, and from approximately the same period, Katharina Sieverding. But again, when you think of contention, would a brilliant artist, the late Lothar Baumgarten, would his work here, would it be regarded as an impossible work to be shown today because of the current concern, the rightful concern about the decolonial? So, you know, again, would we be in a position to show Araki works like these that were collected, were super excitable and very, you know, people all wanted Araki in the 90s and 80s. And here, what would we do with photographs of the Mühlkommune, right? What do you think about this kind of stuff? Not to mention early Marina Abramovic pentagram incisions. So I'm interested at the moment in this kind of work that needs to be renegotiated, just like the ethnographic really needs to. There's a constant need for the renegotiation of meanings around collections. Here, the collection of Ivo Wessel and a brilliant artwork by Luke Willis-Thompson on microfilm. Or here, the Museum of Things in Berlin with a portable research collection, study collection to introduce in that moment, maybe not today, young ladies to domestic chores. Here, photographs from the Heine Niehoff collection. And here, a beginning of this new model of the Metabolic Museum University, where I decided to try and create a kind of overlap and a parallelism and a relationship between, if you like, heterogeneous collections, seeping right out into neighborhood museums, neighborhood collections in Berlin, and a group of people who would come together and in their different ways constitute a new type of faculty in the real sense of the term, an ability, a competence, a group of competence, a group of chairs, if you like. So there is Iman Issa, artist Iman Issa, Christabel Stewart, Henrike Naumann, Luke Willis-Thompson, Augustin Morse, who's also a composer and a musician. There's the writer Tom McCarthy. There's a Senegalese lawyer, El Hadj Abdoulaye Sen. There's the iconologist and art historian Matthias Brun. There is Manuel Reda, designer and publisher, graphic designer, furniture designer. There is Bless, the situation designers, Ines Kaag and Desiree Heiss. There is Azunwak Boku, who I'm working with in Lagos. So there's a connection here between different satellites of working with this whole question of the 20th century in many ways. And of course, there is the feminist anthropologist Margareta von Oswald. But there is also Matt Mullican and Anna Provatsky, who are coming in as artist collectors, as a faculty of artists who collect. And, you know, this was a small meeting inside the Hassan Sharif exhibition at KW, no audience, just us trying to bring a few objects together that might provoke a conversation that would allow us to come together via the conduit of a negotiation between the relationship between different objects. Yeah, so it's not about somebody saying, oh, I got this object and the truth about this object is, and then to provide the context. It's not about a collector saying, I have a real tick and I'm an idiosyncratic lover of all things technical. We're not interested in context in the formalist sense of context, the disciplinary sense of context, and we're not interested in the subjective of the collector. We're interested in the dialogical that takes place here and that causes us to create a new methodology. So with a series of debating chambers, we hope to dissect this new body of the potential museum, eventually after a year behind closed doors, to introduce companions who then go further into the city, who start to investigate the neighborhood museums, and via this bias, bring the public back into the issue. So it's not the public in the casino, it's not the public in the department store, it's the public as an engaged participant in the redesign and the remediation of collections that need to be discussed and brought back in as actually the key energy that we have right now. So I hope that wasn't too long, but that's where I wanted to land. Thank you very much. I look forward to questions.
Thank you very much, Clementine. This was very fascinating to me. Thank you for sharing your experiences, your visions, and take your time. And it was not only fascinating to me because the first questions are coming in. So if you're ready for it, we can immediately go to the questions. There's a question from Sarah. Which narratives do you think can be evoked through the formal narratives you set up between objects of sometimes very different provenance?
This is something that was developed, that we tested out in the Rhetorical Museum. You know, normally when you go into a collection and let's say you want to do an exhibition, you look in a data bank, you have a theme. In ethnographic museums, the hottest themes, the ones that get the most public visibility, are things to do usually with death or ritual or kind of weird stuff, and then lots of people come. And you find all the objects that you want and you work through a data bank. It's a different thing when you go into the storage space, and already you see that there are very clear divisions. So in the case in Frankfurt, we had one floor was Oceania, one was Africa, one was Southeast Asia, one was Oceania, one was Southeast Asia. Did I say them all? I'm not sure. So it was a very, it's a kind of a relatively logical chopping up of artifacts, but it's just one way of doing it. You know, if you take the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford, they did it according to typology, you know, all the pipes together, all the shrunken heads together, this kind of thing. So already when you're bringing together artifacts from different regions, different backgrounds, different uses, you're already creating a jarring. There's a jarring in terms of, okay, so what critical discourse can I employ to elucidate what it is that I have in front of me? When you have a mass accumulation through exploitative imperialist governance of other people's heritage and the denial of the authorship and great part the ownership of these different artifacts, you're placed in front of a kind of a void, which is at the moment people are trying to restitute this void through provenance studies. But these provenance studies are, if I want to be polemical, just one way of reintroducing the value of the ethnographic in the 21st century, which in my opinion no longer exists. In other words, for me, there are no more ethnographic museums. There can't be. There are collections that have been created out of this process of exploitation, but they are the idea that an ethnographic museum or even a world cultures museum could exist today would be to propagate a type of taxonomy, a type of power structure, a type of violence that I don't personally believe is the right way forward. So by bringing together both unauthored artifacts with authored artworks, with artworks that are part of research that are not necessarily on the market, you start to raise a lot of questions about aesthetics, about ethics, about interpretation, about methodology, about value, about economy. And that's what I think I'm interested in doing. I always have been, in seeing what happens if I can bring together in the same moment something that is fundamentally transdisciplinary with something that is fundamentally transcultural.
Thank you. There's another question that's a bit in this direction. The question is, you are working with artifacts, objects, experimental constellations. Have you also worked with intangible, immaterial, or oral history?
Well, I did do, I worked in Scandinavia in the year 2000, and I worked on speech. So I was interested in how you exhibit the voice. I ended up working on the pornographic voice. Is that oral history? I don't know. But for sure, the movement towards oral histories, particularly now, is very, very interesting. And I think that with Home Museum, we have begun this journey. We want to work with the oral representations of history as well as the visual or the written. But already with Home Museum, the fact that the texts that people sent in from around Africa and elsewhere, these texts have nothing to do with a caption, you know. So all these small rehearsals or exercises, they all help us to understand the limitations they act as a contrast medium, right? So a label in a museum of artifacts that have been looted and plundered and are now being re-exhibited on under some kind of universalist idea. If you want to find the true racism, just read the label. It's all there. But it's so reduced. It's like a perverse homeopathic version of the brutality of that particular artifact's history, and the people who made it is all reduced. The name of the artist, everything has been reduced to something that could be placed on a label. And this kind of reductionism was exploded through the very fact that the participants, the co-creators in Home Museum, wrote very long texts to do with COVID, to do with their family, to do with technology, to do with how they felt. And this is a great way of beginning to understand how a museum and a collection can redesign their relationship to visitors, to visitors from all over the world, really.
Now that we're talking about Home Museum, it's not so clear to me. What's the role for homemuseum.net, or what's the future of Home Museum after the festival?
Well, Azun Wakbogo and his team at Lagos Photo, which is part of the African Artists Foundation, have done really very important work over the last 15 years, bringing young photographers together, bringing photographers from different parts of the world together, making a discussion, a conversation take place around photography. This is, as you know, now sort of one of the main channels of aesthetic representation outside of Africa as well as inside of Africa. And he has been interested in the issue of restitution now for several years. And I think it was a possibility that came about independently of Corona, that we would work with the home, the domestic situation. We would begin with what we have, what hasn't been removed from us, where we don't need to have it restituted, right? We don't have to go through a government. And then suddenly Corona took place, and we had Azu's team in Lagos, and I was in Berlin, Asia Yakmurian in Berlin as well, Birds of Knowledge in Hamburg. And then the whole thing started to grow, as many people have experienced, as a sort of a new format, a new infrastructure, a new way of mediating ideas and contacts between people, not just exhibiting, but actually producing a series of arteries between different locations and practices. And so Home Museum, I think, is now going to go further into this question of the 20th century, maybe further into photography. But equally, Home Museum for us is going to also be part of a new type of library, a library in a different sense of the term, perhaps, a library of oral histories as well as photography. And all that is under the rubric of a development called Generator. And Generator also includes for us a focus on modernism, on the other side to restitution, which is again more clearly to do with the 20th century. So the Home Museum will continue, but it has to be like everything. It's a recursive process. And so we will adapt and refine and learn from our mistakes and hopefully have enough feedback in between. We're setting up living room conversations. We want to meet all these people who have contributed, get them to meet each other, and talk.
Thank you. There's a totally other question from Victor Jaramillo. What is your point of view on conservation and restoration? Do you think an object or artifacts have to kept for eternity, or can they have a finite life like an animal or a human being?
When you work in an ethnographic museum, the only person who can say no is the restorer or the conservator. Doesn't matter if the custodians say no, you can pretty much override them as a director. But if the conservator says no, you have a problem. When we had the designers Perks and Minnie, Buki Akib, cassette player from London, we were working with clothing and the whole kind of paraphernalia of dress. And it was forbidden for any one of them to try on any of the clothing. Interestingly, clothing is very often the earliest acquisition of a museum like this, because when you travel, it happens quite often to people. They say, wow, I like you, you're great, but I really like your jumper. Oh, you want mine? Let's swap. So really, the clothing that is in this museum, you wouldn't believe that there was no place you could go in, I don't know, in some part of the world that they explored, that there were no department stores where they didn't want new stuff, they wanted old stuff, soiled things. This is all part of the fetishization of ethnography. But I lost my thread now. Damn, what was I? Conservation. So what I realized very early on was that it's utterly ideological. Conservation is an ideology. It's one of the key issues that prevents enough returns of objects. It's not the key issue, but it's one of them. It's good if objects are looked after, and certainly from my visits to the storage of many museums in Nigeria, I could see that these artifacts were being looked after fine. There was no problem. But here it becomes a very complex, pernicious way of preventing access to the artifacts, introducing notions of, I don't know, there's a kind of a sense that maybe these objects are toxic, that they contain microbiome, that they therefore have to be even more secluded and sequestered than before. And ultimately, there are only three things you can do. You can return, you can bury, or you can remediate, right? The moment you start to remediate, you bring oxygen into circulation, and the artifact may degenerate. If you want to return, then you're going to have to let go. It's not for any person sitting in Berlin to determine, or Paris for that matter, to determine how these artifacts should be returned when they are returned. And thirdly, if you're not going to return and you're not going to remediate, then you only have the option to bury them deeper and deeper. As for example, the Musée du Quai Branly that is constructed obviously with the architect Jean Nouvel. It's 500,000 objects. They place them under the Seine River. Okay, so there are more and more centralized storage spaces being built. And fact is that I don't think, maybe I think there is one particular museum that is trying this out. But the accolades that go to the star architects, they don't go for storage spaces. No one's interested in a storage space. It's like a shed. And yet it's exactly that. That's why I wanted to show you these temporary tents in the Agronomic Institute in Ibadan. But it's exactly that way as, of perceiving the museum in a different way, where conservation then has to be a factor, but it can't be a hindrance, right? You have to think of a different ventilation, oxygenating of these collections.
There's another question. There's a question if there are still donations made to ethnographic museums, and if yes, how did you deal with this during your directorship?
Wow. Every week we would get an email. Oh my God, it was like, my mother left me a big box full of, she was a great explorer. She would go to Nepal. She left me a box of extremely important artifacts that she collected at the time. And we would be honored to provide these, give these to the museum. Either they wanted money, which we didn't have, of course, or they They just wanted them to be in the museum because it's a stamp, right, of approval. It's really groovy if you're, but the problem was that sometimes there was interesting material in there. And the question is, what is interesting, what isn't interesting, right? I'm not going to make a comment on that now. But the process of inventorization meant that they had to be all, they had to go through a type of control that in German, where you use the word entwesen, which is the removal of every kind of living substance. Because, you know, the fear that there might be bugs, all kinds of beetles, all kinds of woodworm, all kinds of moths, right? That might then eat into everything else meant that any new donation had to go through a lengthy process of being hygienically treated, thrown into a deep, you know, into a big freezer fridge for a week, all these kinds of procedures. So this is a problem. I mean, it's normal that the citizens want to hand over their works to a museum, but it caused a lot of consternation amongst the custodians. More interesting for me was when the artists I invited and the writers, the part of the relationship that we had was that they would have 4 weeks in the museum, that they could work with the collection. They had 24-hour access to the collection in the laboratory that was their private space, with studios and apartments and the archive downstairs. But we requested for that, that they would leave something behind. Some kind of the germination of a new project, an experiment of some kind, a thought, a text. And this became very interesting because effectively, when it came to the end of the year, it being a municipal museum, I had to send in the list of the values of every object that had been donated to the museum. Now, when it came to the prototypes of Audubon and Kanga, or an entire collection by Perks and Minnie, or the work of Luke Willis-Thompson, the drawings of Luke Willis-Thompson, when it came to that, it was like, okay, how am I going to gauge the value of this new collection? Do I go to the galleries, right? And ask, so Audubon's gallery, Bayerle's gallery, Luke Willis-Thompson's gallery, how do I gauge the value? And this led to a discussion which I did with the whole team of the museum as to how we would find a logic or a criterion with which to quantify the value if these artifacts were actually part of a type of inquiry. So they were unfinished. And this condition of being unfinished meant that it would have been a travesty to say, okay, this artist is worth more than this artist. These are febrile, suspended systems of value. And this has made me even more curious about research collections for that very reason. So I think that there are ways of developing a collection, but an ethnographic museum that would choose to go out and collect a whole bunch of stuff, it doesn't do it anymore because that type of collecting is done by the Global Universal Art Museum, be it Tate or MoMA. These are the museums that are now going out and purchasing Life's Unknown. They're the ones that are taking the risk of capital that anthropologists took in the past.
Thank you. Now that you were talking about your collaboration with artists, writers, photographs, there's a question from Tanya. And she asks, in Frankfurt, you invited many artists to the collection, putting to the fore the transitional potential of artistic research. What did you learn from this?
In what way what did I learn? I learned a lot. Wow. I learned a lot about the artifacts. I learned a lot about the procedures. I learned a lot about the both negative and positive aspects to the knowledge of the custodians. I learned the importance of the backstage. Perhaps I've always been interested in the backstage, but I really think it's important today. And that's why I'm happy to do another model of the Metabolic Museum University at KW. So again, you know, it's a little bit, when I talk about the backstage, it's like right now, are we all going to continue hanging shows that no one can see? Or are we going to use the pandemic condition to provide space for artists and other researchers and cultural workers to do something during this time of lockdown, right? So that backstage, oddly enough, whereas I want the backstage, and the backstage is considered a problem for funding bodies because it's not public, right? So if you bring a group of people together and you say, let's look at a collection, let's talk together, but we don't want an audience, the audience will change the way we will think. And then Corona comes and you think, oh, great, now I'm not going to be regarded as an elitist curator, right? I'm not denying the audiences. I'm not denying the public. And then, you know, suddenly you find yourself sort of even more perverted by this procedure, and you end up not even being able to do that. So that you can't even do like I want to do a debating chamber inside KW. I can't do it because we can be 5 people, if that. So I've learned to constantly question the prioritization of space, of time, but this is not something I learned at the Weltkultur, and this is already something I learned at the Whitechapel many years back. And these kind of formats that we you know, like if I want to do a show now, if I could, I would begin now with a show in the museum. I wouldn't say, oh, it all gets like prepared in advance, and then when it's ready, we bring the work. No, let's begin now. You know, let's start working in the museum now. Why? What is this normativity that's going on? It's so conservative. We have an event, we have an exhibition, we have a product, we have a website. Is this really where art has landed? Is that what we do art practice for? Is that what we're working for as curators? I don't know. Maybe this is a good moment to talk more. And maybe the backstage is now unfortunately in this kind of strange, disembodied condition, but it's still crucial that we start working to create new alliances for ourselves and for the younger generation.
Okay, maybe one last question from Bruno. Is it acceptable to remove objects from the cultural environment in which they have been produced? And if so, how do you feel about the globalized contemporary art world?
I don't have a moral position on whether you can remove objects from one place or another. Or maybe I haven't understood the question. Maybe it would require more fleshing out. But I do know that the issue of restitution could be seen from another position. You know, if you think about the amount of private collectors, of institutional collectors, the market, so to speak, the way a work by an artist who's in Ghent can somehow be transported to another part of the world, the conditions of access that we deplore with the ethnographic collections may very well turn up being pushed back at us, you know, whereas we're worried about conservation. No, you can't have all these, we can't send you 100,000 artifacts back to Africa because what will happen to it? But it might turn the other way around, and people in another part of the world where a lot of money is, I don't need to even tell you where it is, it's all pretty obvious, might say, no, you can't have this big body of work that I have. You cannot have this other installation. No. And, you know, we don't know what will happen in 100 years. We won't know how this global collecting spree has panned out and whether younger generations in 100 years have access to this material either. So we don't know really what the relationship is between cultural identity and art production at the moment. And it's being narrowed in many ways through identity politics, just as we thought we were moving towards a more trans position in this sense, a more non-identitarian position. we seem to be coming back to a type of definitional position. You know, you have to define yourself, you have to qualify what you're doing, you have to substantiate what you're doing, you have to ask questions about cultural identity, you have all of these things that bring in, for me, the question of counter-conduct into a very important light, and which is what I'm working on now with my students. But the question of the global collecting, well, you know, as I've been told, if Tate brings together a group of African collectors and patrons of the arts in order to develop with Tate a new collection of contemporary work from Africa, then it ends up being the African patrons who are funding the acquisition. And that doesn't seem to make sense, right? You know, there's a lot that can be, yeah, we're in a kind of a state of suspension. Let's see what happens to these global museums, these universal museums. Let's see if they remain the casinos and the department stores that we had in the 1840s, or whether suddenly they will either be repurposed, both in a way that we're interested in and a way that actually could be ultimately quite abhorrent.
Thank you.
But I'm positive, you know, I'm positive.
I think you gave us much food for thought.
Thank you.
So unless you would like to add something, Clementine?
No, I'm very delighted. Thank you very much. And I hope to come to S.M.A.K soon, and maybe we can
Very welcome.
Would be wonderful.
And thank you very much for your time, your lecture, and good luck with all the projects and with the Home Museum.
Thank you.
See you. Thank you.